By the close of the 19th century, the American frontier had begun its final retreat. Vast stretches of wilderness still covered the continent, but each passing year brought another railway, another telegraph line, another county courthouse, and another town where the rule of law reached farther than it had before. The age that had once rewarded trappers, prospectors, bounty hunters, and wandering gunslingers was steadily giving way to one governed by banks, corporations, and government institutions whose reach extended farther than ever before. But first, I want to invite you to something I've been working on for the past month or so. And if you enjoy my content here, I think you're really going to like it. I've started a new channel/podcast called The Sleepy Scriptorium. It is the exact same style of content that you've come to enjoy here. The only difference is, it's about various topics of world history. History to sleep to, if you will. I wanted to plug this new project into this Red Dead Redemption episode because I already have the complete history of Wide Earp up over there, and I figured that's a somewhat relevant bridge. Anyways, I hope that you'll check it out. It would mean a whole bunch. I'll put the links in the description and comments below. Now, back to your regularly scheduled sleep program. For generations, much of the West had existed as a place where distance granted freedom. A determined person could disappear into mountains and forests and build a new life beyond the notice of distant authorities. Entire communities rose and fell in regions where maps remained unfinished and state governments struggled to maintain any lasting presence. The frontier rewarded self-reliance and tolerated those who existed outside conventional society. Men lived by their reputations, by the strength of their word, and often by the speed with which they could draw a revolver. Yet history rarely allows such worlds to endure unchanged. By 1899, the United States was entering an era of rapid industrial expansion unlike anything it had experienced before. Cities grew larger each year as factories drew workers from across the nation and beyond its borders. Steel mills and railroads transformed commerce. Telegraph wires carried news faster than any horse could ride. Financial institutions accumulated unprecedented influence, while politicians increasingly viewed the remaining untamed territories as opportunities for investment rather than frontiers to be explored. The wilderness itself had begun to shrink. Forests were cleared to make room for farms and settlements. Buffalo herds, once numbering in the millions, had been hunted almost to extinction within a single generation. Native nations, after decades of war and forced displacement, found themselves confined to reservations where government agents dictated the rhythms of their daily life. The independent cultures that had defined so much of the West were steadily being replaced by bureaucracies, property deeds, and legal jurisdictions. To many Americans, this represented progress, but to others, it marked the end of something deeply personal. There remained people who could still remember a country where the horizon promised uncertainty rather than regulation. They remembered sleeping beneath open skies, surviving by their own hands, and living beyond the reach of distant officials whose authority seemed little more than an abstract idea. Some had been ranchers or hunters. Others had served as soldiers or scouts, and a small number had chosen lives that existed entirely outside the law. These were the outlaws. Popular imagination often painted them as fearless adventurers, robbing banks and trains while riding toward another sunset. the reality was far more complicated. Many began their lives in poverty or tragedy. Some turned to crime because legitimate opportunities had vanished, while others simply found themselves unable or unwilling to accept the increasingly ordered society around them. They formed gangs not only for profit, but for survival, building substitute families among people who shared similar pasts and similar distrust of authority. Among the last of these organizations was the Vanderlyn Gang. Unlike many outlaw bands that relied solely upon intimidation and greed, the Vanderlyn Gang carried with it a philosophy. Its leader, Dutch Vanderlyn, spoke not merely of stealing wealth, but of resisting a civilization he believed had become consumed by corruption and materialism. He imagined a life where his followers might remain free from governments, banks, and industrialists alike. Around campfires and beneath towering pines, he spoke of liberty with the conviction of a preacher delivering a sermon. For those who had nowhere else to belong, his words held extraordinary power. The gang became less a criminal enterprise than an adopted family. Children without parents found guardians. Drifters found companionship. Men and women who had been discarded by respectable society discovered purpose beneath Dutch's leadership. Around him gathered individuals whose names would later become inseparable from the closing years of the outlaw era. Hosea Matthews, the thoughtful confidence man whose wisdom often tempered Dutch's ambitions. John Marston, rescued as a troubled youth and raised within the gang's embrace. Abigail Roberts, whose quiet strength would prove essential during its darkest days. Charles Smith, whose integrity remained steadfast even as others faltered. Sadie Adler, whose entire world would be destroyed before she forged herself into one of the most formidable survivors of the frontier. And among them stood Arthur Morgan. But long before his name became known across 5 states, Arthur had simply been another lost child. He possessed no famous family name. No inheritance awaited him. No promising future had been laid before him at birth. Like many children on the frontier, circumstance shaped his earliest years more than choice ever could. Violence, hardship, and loss would arrive long before his adulthood, leaving him vulnerable to a world where survival often demanded difficult compromises. When Dutch found the boy, he saw another orphan wandering the edges of civilization. But this one, he believed, was someone worth saving. Arthur would spend the next 2 decades learning not from schools or churches, but from the roads that wound through forests and plains, from campfires beneath unfamiliar constellations, and from the men and women who became his family. He'd learned to ride before most children learned to read. He learned patience while hunting, caution while robbing, and loyalty above nearly every other virtue. Dutch gave him ideas. Hosea gave him wisdom. Together they shaped the young orphan into the gang's most dependable enforcer. For years, Arthur believed without hesitation. He believed Dutch truly sought freedom rather than wealth. He believed the gang represented something better than ordinary criminals. Most importantly, he believed loyalty alone could overcome whatever hardships awaited them. Such convictions would sustain him through countless dangers, but they would also blind him to the truths that revealed themselves only slowly, often painfully, across the years of the 19th century. Because the greatest threat facing Arthur Morgan was never that of a rival gunslinger, an ambitious sheriff, or the expanding reach of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. It was time itself. The world that had created men like Arthur was quietly disappearing. Every new railroad narrowed another escape route. Every growing city extended another arm of government authority. Every successful bank symbolized a future in which men living beyond the law had fewer places left to hide. The Vanderlyn gang would continue riding westward for a while longer, but eventually there would be no west left to ride toward. Arthur Morgan's story unfolds during those final uncertain years, when one age was giving way to another. It is a tale of loyalty tested against conscience, of family held together by ideals that gradually began to fracture, and of a man who spent much of his life believing redemption belonged to other people before discovering, in the time remaining to him, that it might still be possible to choose a different path. His life would become inseparable from the death of the Old West itself. As one disappeared, so too did the other, leaving behind a legacy remembered not merely for its violence, but for the quiet humanity that endured even as the frontier slipped into history. Long before Arthur Morgan became one of the most capable men in the Vanderlyn gang, he was just another child born into the uncertain world of the American frontier. His story began around the year 1863, while the United States was consumed by civil war. Although the great battles that defined the conflict took place far from where Arthur spent much of his youth, the nation that emerged afterward remained fractured in quieter ways. Entire regions struggled with poverty. Violence lingered in places where soldiers had returned home carrying old grievances. And countless children grew up in communities where survival demanded resilience long before adulthood. Arthur entered that world with little to inherit beyond hardship. His mother died while he was still a young boy, leaving memories so distant that they would become difficult even for Arthur himself to recall. The law shaped him in subtle ways. Throughout his life, he rarely spoke of her, not because she lacked importance, but because grief experienced so early often settles into silence rather than conversation. She became less a memory than an absence that accompanied him wherever he traveled. His father, Lyle Morgan, remained. Lyle was an outlaw by trade, a man who lived beyond the law with little regard for its consequences. Records of his crime were sparse, as they often were for men who drifted from territory to territory. But what is known paints the picture of someone hardened by violence and accustomed to life on the run. Arthur would later remember his father as an angry man whose temper frequently overshadowed whatever affection he may have possessed. There were lessons a child could learn from such a parent. Arthur learned to ride horses before many boys his age had mastered reading. He became familiar with firearms, not as curiosities, but as ordinary tools of daily life. Campsites, rough cabins, and temporary shelters became more familiar than permanent homes. The frontier itself served as his classroom, teaching practical skills while offering little in the way of security. Yet, Lyle Morgan was never able to outrun the consequences of his choices. At some point during Arthur's youth, he was arrested for theft. The law finally caught the man who had spent years living beyond its reach. Arthur would later recall seeing his father hanged, a memory that remained with him long after childhood had passed. He was still only a boy when he watched the only parent he had left die upon the gallows. Whatever affection Arthur held for Lyle existed alongside resentment. Years later, he would admit that his father had been cruel, and that witnessing his execution had not filled him solely with sorrow. There was pity for the man who had failed to escape his own nature. But there was also recognition that the life Lyle had chosen had always been leading towards such an end. The execution left Arthur alone. An orphan on the American frontier possessed few opportunities. Churches sometimes took in abandoned children. Some found work on ranches in exchange for food and shelter. Others drifted into mining camps or towns, where they survived however they could. Many disappeared into lives of poverty, from which they never escaped. Arthur's path changed because two men happened to cross it before the world discarded him entirely. Their names were Dutch Vanderland and Hosea Matthews. By the time they encountered Arthur, Dutch and Hosea had already spent years traveling together. Though both existed outside the law, they differed greatly in temperament. Hosea possessed patience, where Dutch possessed certainty. He preferred careful planning to reckless displays of force, and often relied upon deception rather than violence. Dutch, meanwhile, possessed extraordinary charisma. He spoke with confidence about freedom, justice, and the corruption of modern civilization, convincing those around him that their lives carried meaning beyond simple banditry. Together, they formed an unlikely partnership. Neither man viewed himself as an ordinary criminal. They robbed the wealthy, targeted institutions they believed represented greed, and spoke openly about building a community that could exist beyond the reach of governments and corporations. Whether these ideals always matched their actions was another matter entirely. But in those early years, the dream remained sincere enough to inspire remarkable loyalty. When they found Arthur, they saw something more than another abandoned child. Dutch later claimed he had saved the boy, and Arthur himself rarely disputed that belief. Instead of leaving him to whatever fate awaited orphans on the frontier, Dutch welcomed him into their small circle. Hosea became equally important, offering a quieter form of guidance that balanced Dutch's powerful influence. And between them, Arthur had found something he had lost years earlier: family. Life within this unusual household differed greatly from conventional society. There were no classrooms, no fixed address, no settled occupation. Instead, education came through experience. Dutch instructed Arthur in reading and encouraged him to think beyond simple survival. He introduced him to literature, philosophy, and political ideas, believing that an outlaw should possess an educated mind as well as a steady hand. Arthur would never become a scholar, yet throughout his life, he displayed surprising intelligence beneath his reserved demeanor. He read newspapers, reflected deeply upon the people around him, and filled journals with thoughtful observations that revealed far greater sensitivity than his rugged appearance suggested. Hosea taught different lessons. He demonstrated how to judge character, how to speak calmly during tense negotiations, and how patience often achieved what violence could not. He showed Arthur that confidence required careful study of human nature, and that every successful plan depended upon understanding how people thought rather than merely overpowering them. From both men, Arthur learned loyalty. It became the central principle of his life. The gang's members depended upon one another for protection, food, shelter, and companionship. Betrayal carried consequences far greater than imprisonment, because it threatened the survival of everyone involved. Over time, Arthur came to believe that loyalty itself was a virtue beyond question. If Dutch gave an order, Arthur carried it out. Another member required protection. Arthur provided it. Doubt rarely entered the equation. As the years passed, the small partnership expanded into something much larger. Others joined them, each bringing history shaped by hardship. Some had escaped abusive homes. Others fled poverty, discrimination, failed marriages, or troubled pasts that respectable society refused to forgive. Around campfires scattered across the American West, these strangers slowly became brothers and sisters in everything except blood. Young John Marston entered the gang after Arthur, rescued by Dutch when he was still a boy wandering without direction. Arthur regarded him almost as a younger brother, though the relationship would prove complicated. John's stubbornness frequently clashed with Arthur's discipline, and while genuine affection existed between them, so too did rivalry and frustration. For Arthur, however, there was never any question about where he belonged. The Vanderlyn gang was home. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, Arthur had grown into a capable young man. Years of riding across the frontier had made him an exceptional horseman. Endless hunting trips sharpened his patience and marksmanship. Countless robberies taught him how to remain calm when situations turned dangerous. While Dutch continued serving as the gang's visionary and Hosea as its strategist, Arthur increasingly became the dependable hand who transformed plans into reality. He earned respect not through speeches, but through reliability. If supplies needed gathering, Arthur volunteered. If someone required rescuing, Arthur rode out. If violence became unavoidable, others looked toward Arthur with quiet confidence. But this reputation carries burdens as well as admiration. Dependability often meant being asked to shoulder the most difficult responsibilities. Arthur accepted them willingly, believing that sacrifice for the family justified whatever personal cost accompanied it. Despite the hardships of outlaw life, these decades represented something close to a golden age for the Vanderlyn gang. The American frontier still offered space enough to disappear. Remote valleys sheltered temporary camps. Small settlements lacked the resources to pursue criminals across state lines. Railroads continued expanding westward, carrying payrolls, valuables, and opportunities for robbery into territories where law enforcement remained thinly stretched. The gang prospered, not because they possessed overwhelming strength, but because the world still contained room for people like them. And even so, subtle changes had already begun. Every year, more towns appeared where wilderness once stood. Telegraph poles marched steadily across open country. Private detective agencies, most notably the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, expanded their operations on behalf of railroads, banks, and industrialists. Criminal investigations became more coordinated, making it more difficult for outlaw gangs to vanish after each robbery. Dutch noticed these developments. He spoke often about civilization closing its grip upon the country. To Arthur, these speeches sounded less like warnings than simple truths. He trusted Dutch completely, believing his adopted father understood the world better than anyone else ever could. He could not yet see that Dutch himself was beginning to change. But for now, those transformations remained hidden beneath confidence and eloquence. The family endured. Campfires still burned beneath the stars. Laughter echoed through forests after successful robberies. Hope remained alive that somewhere beyond the next mountain lay the freedom that Dutch had always promised. Arthur believed in that future with all the certainty of a son believing his father. He had lost one family to cruelty and death. He never imagined he might one day lose another to something far more painful. Not violence, but disillusionment. By the final years of the 19th century, Arthur Morgan had become the man upon whom the Vanderlyn gang quietly depended. Dutch remained its voice, Hosea its conscience, but Arthur had become its steady hands. The boy who had once followed Dutch through forests and across lonely stretches of prairie had grown into a broad-shouldered man. His reputation stretched across much of the American West. He rarely sought attention, nor did he possess Dutch's gift for speeches. Yet nearly everyone within the gang trusted Arthur above almost anyone else. When difficult work needed doing, Dutch called upon Arthur. When disagreements threatened to divide the camp, Hosea often relied upon Arthur's judgment. Even those who occasionally argued with him understood that his loyalty was rarely motivated by pride or ambition. Arthur simply believed it was his responsibility to carry the burdens others could not. Years of hardship had shaped him into precisely the kind of man the frontier demanded. He could track game through fresh snowfall before dawn, survive for days with little more than his horse and a rifle, and navigate territories that remained unfamiliar even to local lawmen. He had become a skilled marksman, though he never treated violence as something to celebrate. To Arthur, shooting another man was rarely a triumph. It was usually the consequence of choices already made. His journal, carried wherever he traveled, revealed a side of him few ever witnessed. Between rough sketches of mountains, abandoned churches, birds, and strangers he encountered along the road, Arthur recorded observations that betrayed a surprisingly thoughtful nature. He admired beautiful landscapes, questioned the motives of powerful men, and occasionally reflected upon the life he had chosen. Though he seldom spoke openly about such thoughts around the campfire, they suggest that even during the gang's happier years, Arthur possessed a quiet awareness that the world was changing around them. Still, his faith in Dutch remained largely unshaken. Dutch continued to speak of freedom with unwavering confidence. Every failed robbery became temporary misfortune. Every successful escape proved that they remained one step ahead of civilization. Around the campfire, he described distant lands where governments held little power, and where honest people might finally live without interference from bankers or politicians. Sometimes he spoke of Australia. Other times it was Tahiti. The destination changed from year to year, but the promise remained constant. One final score, one last robbery, one more escape. Arthur believed in him because for most of his life, Dutch had always seemed to know the way forward. The gang itself had grown into an unusual community, unlike almost any other operating beyond the law. Susan Grimshaw maintained discipline within camp, the sternness few dared challenge. Pearson, once a sailor, prepared meals and kept supplies organized. Uncle contributed little that could be measured, yet somehow always remained part of the family. Javier Escuela brought stories from Mexico, while Bill Williamson offered brute strength that frequently exceeded his judgment. Sean McGuire filled evenings with loud laughter and reckless enthusiasm. And young Lenny Summers displayed an intelligence and curiosity that reminded many of Arthur's younger self. There was also Charles Smith, quiet, observant, and deeply principled. Charles possessed a calm strength that Arthur respected immediately. Born to an African-American father and a Native American mother, Charles had spent much of his life existing between worlds, accepted fully by neither. Unlike many others within the gang, he carried little interest in Dutch's grand speeches. Instead, he judged people by their actions. In Arthur, he found someone who often did the same. And then there was Micah Bell. If Arthur represented the dependable heart of the gang, Micah embodied many of its darker instincts. He had joined relatively recently compared with many of the others, and Arthur never fully trusted him. Micah enjoyed violence in ways that disturbed even seasoned outlaws. He possessed undeniable skill with a revolver and remarkable courage under fire, but beneath those talents lay cruelty that seemed to require little provocation. Where Arthur preferred avoiding unnecessary bloodshed, Micah frequently appeared to welcome it. Dutch, however, admired Micah's fearlessness. It was an admiration that would gradually deepen over time. For now, it remained only a subtle shift, easy to overlook amid years of friendship and shared hardship. Arthur certainly overlooked it. Life within the gang continued according to rhythms established over decades. Camp moved whenever authorities drew too close. Members hunted, fished, gathered supplies, repaired wagons, and cared for one another between robberies. Evenings often ended around a fire beneath open skies. Songs drifted through camp while bottles passed from hand to hand. Stories grew taller with each retelling. Arguments flared and faded. Children laughed as they chased one another through the trees. For all of its flaws, the Vanderlyn gang often resembled a family far more than a criminal enterprise. Children like Jack Marston knew dozens of adults who helped raise him. Illnesses were tended collectively. Losses were shared by everyone. Birthdays, though seldom marked by gifts, were remembered with warmth. Arthur had grown to value these ordinary moments more than the robberies themselves, though he rarely admitted as much. His own life outside the gang, however, carried regrets that remained buried beneath years of silence. In his younger days, Arthur had had relations with a woman named Eliza, and together they had had a son named Isaac. But Arthur knew that he could never fully leave the gang. He did, however, promise to do right by them. He'd visit whenever he could, bringing money earned through outlaw work in hopes of giving them a better life than he had himself known. For a time, he imagined that might be enough. He was wrong. One day, Arthur arrived expecting another brief reunion. Instead, he found two graves. Bandits seeking easy money had murdered both Eliza and young Isaac for the few dollars Arthur had left behind. This loss shattered something inside of him. Unlike the death of his parents, this grief arrived during adulthood, when he fully understood what had been taken. Arthur seldom spoke of Isaac afterward, yet those closest to him recognized that the event had changed him profoundly. Whatever dreams he may have once entertained about leaving the outlaw life quietly disappeared. If the gang had once been his chosen family, it now became almost his only family. Dutch, perhaps unknowingly, occupied even more space in Arthur's life than before. Looking back, Arthur would later realize how completely he had entrusted his future to another man's vision. At the time, it simply felt natural. The gang continued moving across the country as America continued changing around them. Railroad companies extended tracks into territories that had once required weeks of horseback travel. Telegraph offices connected distant towns almost instantly. Pinkerton detectives developed increasingly sophisticated methods for tracking fugitives across state lines. Wealth accumulated within expanding cities, while isolated frontier settlements slowly adopted the institutions of the East. Dutch interpreted each development as further proof that civilization itself had become corrupt. More than ever, his speeches reflected a belief that modern society was incapable of producing genuine freedom. Laws protected wealth rather than justice. Governments served industry rather than ordinary people. Banks accumulated fortunes while poor families struggled to survive. There was truth within many of his observations, yet Dutch's certainty gradually hardened into something less flexible. Where Hosea often saw complexity, Dutch increasingly saw enemies. Arthur noticed little of this transformation. He remained too busy carrying out Dutch's plans, settling disputes, hunting food, and protecting those who depended upon him. Loyalty had become so deeply rooted within him that questioning Dutch scarcely entered his mind. The final years before the gang's collapse therefore passed with an almost deceptive sense of normality. There were successful robberies, close escapes, campfire celebrations, arguments that ended in laughter by morning. The family endured, yet beneath the surface, pressures continued mounting. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had begun treating outlaw gangs not as isolated nuisances, but as organized threats requiring systematic pursuit. Wealthy industrialists hired detectives to protect railroads and banks. State governments cooperated more closely than they had in earlier decades. Every robbery left trails that became harder to erase. The frontier itself no longer concealed men as effectively as it once had. Dutch believed one sufficiently large robbery would finally provide the means to escape forever. Hosea remained cautious. Arthur trusted them both. And then came Blackwater. The town itself sat upon the western edge of the Great Plains, prosperous and rapidly modernizing. It represented precisely the sort of place Dutch claimed to despise. Wealthy, expanding, and connected to the institutions reshaping America. Yet, intelligence reached the gang that an enormous sum of money would soon be transported through the settlement. The opportunity seemed irresistible. Against Hosea's advice, Dutch committed the entire gang to the robbery. Exactly what occurred during those desperate hours remains partially obscured by conflicting accounts, for those who survived rarely spoke of it in detail. The robbery collapsed almost immediately. Pinkerton agents appeared in overwhelming force. Gunfire erupted throughout the streets. Innocent people were caught amid the violence. During the chaos, Dutch shot a young woman named Heidi McCourt. The circumstances surrounding her death would haunt those who witnessed it. Dutch later insisted that he had acted out of necessity, but others quietly wondered whether something deeper had changed within the man they followed. Arthur did not see the shooting himself, but he saw its consequences. Several members of the gang were killed during the escape, including Davy Callender and Jenny Kirk. Mac Callender vanished, later believed to have died from wounds suffered while fleeing. Sean McGuire disappeared during the retreat, leaving the others uncertain whether he had escaped or been captured. Most devastating of all, the gang abandoned the fortune they had risked everything to steal. The money remained hidden somewhere within Blackwater, inaccessible while Pinkerton detectives flooded the region. The dream of one final score had become a catastrophe. Bruised, exhausted, grieving, and pursued across the mountains by lawmen who seemed determined to eradicate them completely, surviving members fled north toward the snow-covered peaks of the Grizzlies. Behind them lay Blackwater. Ahead lay a brutal winter, and the beginning of the story for which Arthur Morgan would be remembered. For the first time in decades, the Vanderlyn gang was no longer riding toward freedom. It was simply trying to survive. The mountains welcomed the Vanderlyn gang with neither mercy nor comfort. Snow buried the trails beneath drifts deep enough to swallow horses, while bitter winds swept through the Grizzlies, the force that seemed determined to drive every living thing back toward the valleys below. After the disaster at Blackwater, the survivors reached an abandoned mining settlement called Coulter, where empty cabins offered enough shelter to escape the worst of winter. There, amid frozen silence, one of the most celebrated outlaw gangs in the American West found itself reduced to little more than refugees. Food was scarce. Warm clothing had been left behind during the frantic escape. Several members were wounded, while others carried grief that left them withdrawn around the campfire. The confidence that had once defined Dutch's leadership remained, but even he could not disguise the reality of their circumstances. They possessed little money, no secure refuge, and an army of Pinkerton detectives searching for them farther south. For perhaps the first time since Arthur had known him, Dutch found himself reacting to events rather than controlling them. But Arthur, as always, became the man who kept the camp alive. While others recovered from injuries or exhaustion, he rode into the mountains searching for supplies. Hunting parties ventured into forests where wolves stalked the snow-covered ridges, while abandoned homesteads became valuable sources of food, blankets, and medicine. Every successful expedition brought the gang another few days of survival. During one such journey, Arthur and Javier tracked signs that John Marston might still be alive. John had become separated from the gang during their escape from Blackwater, disappearing into the mountains alone. Several days passed without word of him, and many quietly feared the worst. Winter storms could kill even experienced frontiersmen, while wolves hunted in packs that grew bolder as food became scarce. Following scattered tracks across frozen cliffs, Arthur and Javier finally found John gravely wounded after a wolf attack. Bringing him safely back to Coulter required determination as much as strength, but it was simply what family did, begrudgingly or otherwise. John's survival strengthened bonds that had endured for decades, though neither he nor Arthur expressed much sentimentality afterward. Their relationship had always been marked by quiet affection hidden beneath frequent disagreements. Arthur often criticized John's stubbornness and immaturity, while John bristled whenever Arthur treated him like a younger brother. Even so, each trusted the other when circumstances demanded it. While out scavenging one evening, Micah told Dutch that he had found an occupied cabin some ways through the blizzard. While Dutch sought a conversation with the inhabitants, Arthur and Micah hid in cover nearby. That would prove wise when the cabin turned out to be filled with members of the Vanderlyn gang's rivals, the O'Driscolls. The following confrontation ended with the death of those O'Driscolls and the discovery of a woman named Sadie Adler, who had lived in the cabin with her husband before the O'Driscolls murdered him. And just like so many others of the Vanderlyn gang, defined and left alone by loss, she was brought into the welcoming arms of the gang. The O'Driscolls themselves represented an old and bitter rivalry stretching back years before Arthur had entered adulthood. Their leader, Colm O'Driscoll, had once shared a friendship with Dutch before hatred consumed whatever respect had existed between them. Neither man seemed entirely innocent in the feud that followed. Each blamed the other for deaths that could never be undone, and revenge became so deeply woven into both gangs that younger members often inherited animosities without fully understanding how they had begun. Arthur had fought O'Driscolls for so long that conflict with them felt almost inevitable. Still, Even he recognized that old feuds mattered little compared to the far greater threat now pursuing them. As winter gradually loosened its grip upon the mountains, opportunity finally presented itself. After learning from the O'Driscolls at the cabin of their plan to rob a train, the gang sabotaged them once more and now planned to execute that robbery themselves. The gang ambushed a train owned by the wealthy railroad magnate Leviticus Cornwall, whose growing business empire represented precisely the kind of industrial power Dutch condemned in his speeches. The robbery provided desperately needed currency and enough confidence for Dutch to believe that their fortunes had begun to turn. In reality, it accomplished something else. Cornwall possessed resources unlike those of ordinary victims. He did not simply accept his losses and move on. Wealth allowed him to hire Pinkerton detectives in large numbers, directing their considerable resources toward the destruction of those responsible for robbing his train. The train robbery transformed the Vanderlyn gang from troublesome outlaws into personal enemies of one of the most influential businessmen in the country. Without fully realizing it, Dutch had escalated the conflict dramatically. Leaving the mountains behind, the gang eventually settled into the gentler countryside of Horseshoe Overlook, overlooking the heartlands of New Hanover. After weeks surrounded by snow and hardships, the green hills seemed almost idyllic. Horses grazed peacefully across open fields. Rivers wound lazily through fertile valleys. Small farms dotted the landscape, while nearby towns offered opportunities for trade, information, and employment. For a brief time, life almost represented the happier years Arthur remembered. Evening songs returned, and laughter became common once again. Arthur hunted regularly, keeping the camp well supplied while assisting Dutch in rebuilding their finances. Hosea pursued quieter opportunities through confidence schemes and livestock theft rather than open violence, believing the gang should remain inconspicuous while authorities focused their attention elsewhere. Arthur generally agreed with Hosea. Their conversations increasingly revealed a shared preference for caution over spectacle. The older Hosea had watched Dutch longer than Arthur had, and subtle concerns had begun creeping into his observations. Though he rarely criticized Dutch openly, he often suggested less dangerous alternatives whenever grand robberies were proposed. Arthur listened respectfully, but habit still inclined him towards Dutch's judgment. It was during these weeks that Arthur encountered people whose lives existed entirely outside the world of outlaws. Some were farmers struggling against debt. Others were travelers seeking new beginnings. Doctors, priests, hunters, veterans, widows, immigrants, and laborers crossed his path as he rode through the countryside. Arthur often approached these encounters with surprising kindness, helping strangers whenever circumstances allowed. Such moments rarely benefited the gang materially, yet they revealed a compassionate nature that outlaw life had never completely extinguished. These experiences quietly expanded Arthur's perspective. The world beyond the gang no longer seemed populated solely by enemies or potential victims. It was filled with ordinary people attempting to survive in an increasingly complicated age. Dutch, meanwhile, remained focused on larger ambitions. He continued insisting that one final fortune would secure everyone's future. Every successful robbery encouraged him to believe the setback at Blackwater had merely delayed their destiny rather than altered it. Yet beneath that confidence, cracks continued to appear. One afternoon, while conducting business in the town of Valentine, Dutch Arthur and Micah became involved in an altercation that escalated into bloodshed. Though the gang escaped once again, incidents of public violence were becoming more frequent. Where Hosea preferred patience, Dutch relied upon boldness. Where Arthur once believed such confidence represented strength, he slowly began noticing that each victory seemed to create larger problems than it solved. The arrival of Agent Andrew Milton confirmed those suspicions. Milton and his fellow Pinkerton Edgar Ross located the gang's camp with unsettling ease. But rather than immediately launching an assault, they approached openly to deliver a warning. They knew precisely who Dutch was. They knew Arthur's name. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the wilderness no longer concealed the gang as effectively as it once had. Milton offered Dutch a simple proposition: surrender himself, and they'd give the rest of the gang 3 days to disperse and go live as regular people. Dutch seemingly accepted the deal, but the unity of the gang ran deeper than Milton realized. The gang unholstered their weapons, unwilling to let their charismatic leader take such a deal. Milton was forced to flee, and consequently so was the Vanderlyn gang, seeking a new safe haven away from the Pinkertons' prying eyes. To Arthur, the encounter seemed another example of government oppression directed against people who simply wished to live freely. And looking back, however, it also revealed something else. The Pinkertons were no longer chasing ghosts. They understood the Vanderlyn gang better than ever before. Despite these warnings, Dutch soon became captivated by another opportunity. To the south lay the neighboring state of Lemoyne, where two wealthy families, the Greys and the Braithwaites, had maintained a bitter rivalry for generations. Each possessed considerable influence, substantial landholdings, and long histories rooted in the fading traditions of the Old South. Dutch believed he could manipulate both families against one another while quietly enriching the gang. It was exactly the sort of elaborate scheme he loved, and Arthur followed without objection. The gang packed their belongings, dismantled the camp at Horseshoe Overlook, and journeyed toward the warm forest and marshlands surrounding roads. Once again, they carried with them the same dream that had sustained them for decades: survive one more season, earn one more fortune, and ride toward the freedom that always seemed to lie just beyond the next horizon. And Arthur still believed they could reach it. Yet, as the wagons rolled southward, the differences between Dutch and Hosea had grown more noticeable than ever. Hosea counseled patience, discretion, and measured risk. Dutch spoke increasingly of destiny, opportunity, and the need for bold action. Standing between them, Arthur remained loyal to both men. He could not yet see that the distance separating their visions was widening with every passing mile. The roads through Lemoyne would soon force him to confront a painful realization. The greatest danger facing the Vanderlyn gang no longer came from rival outlaws, railroad magnates, or Pinkerton detectives. It was beginning to emerge from within the family itself. Lemoyne was unlike any place Arthur Morgan had ever called home. The broad grasslands of New Hanover gave way to humid forests draped in moss, sluggish rivers that disappeared into sprawling marshes, and plantations that stood as reminders of a society still haunted by the Civil War. Though more than 3 decades had passed since the Confederacy's defeat, old loyalties lingered throughout the region. Weathered veterans gathered beneath courthouse porches to reminisce about a vanished cause, while once powerful families struggled to preserve wealth and prestige that diminished with each passing year. For Dutch van der Linde, it seemed fertile ground for opportunity. For Arthur, it felt like another unfamiliar landscape through which the gang would eventually pass. The van der Linde gang established a new camp at Clemens Point, along the shores of Flatiron Lake. Hidden beneath towering trees, it was among the most peaceful camps they had occupied in years. The lake reflected calm evenings of orange and violet light. Fishing became plentiful once again, and for a short while, it appeared almost as though the family had found another temporary sanctuary. But appearances can be deceptive. Dutch's newest scheme centered upon two of Lemoyne's oldest families, the Braithwaites and the Greys. For generations, these wealthy dynasties had feuded over land, politics, and pride. The causes of their rivalry had become so deeply buried beneath decades of resentment that even many members of the families themselves scarcely understood how it had begun. What remained was habit. Each regarded the other with suspicion, believing every setback to be the work of their longtime enemy. Dutch believed that feud offered an opportunity. If the gang could quietly manipulate both families, encouraging distrust while profiting from each side, they might finally acquire the fortune they needed to disappear forever. Arthur followed the plan without objection. Once again, loyalty outweighing caution. Members of the gang found themselves working for both households, presenting different faces depending upon whom they addressed. Arthur rode with Dutch to Braithwaite Manor, where the family welcomed them with polite hospitality, masking generations of arrogance. The Braithwaites remained wealthy through tobacco cultivation, though their fortunes had diminished since the abolition of slavery. They clung stubbornly to memories of former greatness, maintaining appearances even as their influence steadily declined. The Grey family projected a different image. Rather than retreating into nostalgia, they embraced positions of local authority. Sheriff Lee Grey and his relatives exercised considerable control over the nearby town of Rhodes, presenting themselves as respectable leaders safeguarding law and order. Yet, beneath that respectable exterior lay the same bitterness that had consumed both families for decades. Arthur quickly discovered that neither household deserved admiration. Both manipulated neighbors. Both concealed uncomfortable truths. Both cared more for preserving family pride than improving the lives of those around them. As Dutch's scheme unfolded, Arthur participated in cattle thefts, moonshine operations, and acts of sabotage intended to deepen suspicion between the rival families. At first, everything appeared to proceed according to plan. Each family accepted the gang's assistance while blaming the other for setbacks carefully orchestrated behind the scenes. Dutch grew overwhelmingly confident. He spoke again of the final score, again of escape, of freedom waiting just beyond reach. Arthur wanted to believe him. Yet something about the entire affair felt increasingly fragile. Every deception required another lie. Every successful manipulation demanded a more dangerous one afterward. Rather than bringing the gang closer to safety, Dutch's plans seemed to entangle them ever more deeply in conflicts that had little to do with their own survival. Then, the illusion collapsed. The Greys had uncovered the deception. Whether through careful investigation or simple suspicion, they realized the outsiders had been playing both sides from the beginning. They chose to respond not through negotiation, but through an ambush. Arthur, Bill Williamson, and Sean McGuire rode into Rhodes believing they were attending an ordinary meeting. Instead, armed men surrounded them. Before anyone could fully understand what was happening, shots rang through the street. Sean McGuire was struck in the head and killed instantly. There was no warning, no farewell. One moment he was laughing beside Arthur, the next he lay motionless in the dust. Arthur had little time to process what he had witnessed before returning fire alongside Bill. The peaceful streets of Rhodes erupted into chaos as the gang fought desperately to escape. When the shooting finally ended, Sean's body was carried back to camp, where grief settled heavily over everyone who had called him family. Sean had often been reckless. He spoke too loudly, celebrated too enthusiastically, and rarely considered consequences before acting. Yet beneath the bravado was a young man whose optimism had brightened even difficult days. His death struck the camp with unusual force. It also struck Arthur. Though he had witnessed countless killings throughout his life, Sean's death felt different. It was sudden, senseless, and accomplished nothing beyond deepening the cycle of violence already surrounding them. For Dutch, however, the response was immediate. Revenge. Any lingering restraint vanished. When the gang returned to Clemens Point, another devastating discovery awaited them. Jack Marston was gone. The young boy had been kidnapped. Evidence quickly pointed toward the Braithwaites, whose elderly matriarch, Catherine Braithwaite, had secretly delivered the child to the Italian crime lord, Angelo Bronte, in nearby Saint Denis, hoping to secure favor and profit while striking at those who had humiliated her family. The kidnapping transformed everything. Whatever games Dutch had imagined playing between rival aristocratic families came to an abrupt end. For Arthur, Jack's disappearance became intensely personal. He still carried the grief of losing his own son years earlier. Watching Abigail and John suffer the terror of losing their child reopened wounds he had never truly healed. There would be no negotiation, only action. That night, the Vanderlyn gang rode together toward Braithwaite Manor. It remains one of the most striking moments in their history. The entire family advanced across the plantation grounds beneath gathering darkness, rifles and revolvers in hand. There was little shouting and almost no hesitation. Years of shared hardship had forged them into something resembling a military company more than a loose gathering of outlaws. Arthur walked beside Dutch. John marched with quiet fury. Charles, Javier, Bill, Micah, and the others spread across the estate. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. Braithwaite guards fell back beneath overwhelming resistance as the gang fought its way through the sprawling mansion. Rooms that had once hosted lavish gatherings filled instead with smoke and splintered wood. Portraits of long-dead ancestors crashed from the walls, while decades of inherited wealth vanished amid the violence. Eventually, they found Catherine Braithwaite herself. The old woman, stripped of every illusion of authority, admitted that Jack had already been delivered to Angelo Bronte in Saint Denis. Her family's great house had become a ruin around her. Dutch allowed her to remain as the gang departed. Moments later, flames consumed Braithwaite Manor. Arthur watched the fire from horseback alongside the others. The burning plantation illuminated the night sky for miles, reducing generations of wealth and pride to collapsing timbers and drifting embers. Yet even that dramatic victory brought little satisfaction. Jack was still missing. The gang had won another battle without solving the larger problem. Dutch insisted they would retrieve the boy from Saint Denis. No one questioned him. Saint Denis represented everything Dutch claimed to oppose. Unlike the frontier towns the gangs knew so well, it was a bustling industrial city where electric lights illuminated broad streets and factories crowded the waterfront. Wealth, politics, Organized crime, international commerce, and modern policing intersected there in ways unseen elsewhere in the American West. Arthur immediately sensed that this city belonged to a different age. Horse-drawn wagons still moved through its streets, but they shared them with electric streetcars. Grand banks towered over crowded neighborhoods where immigrants from around the world sought opportunity. Telegraph offices, newspapers, factories, universities, and government institutions flourished together beneath an increasingly modern skyline. The wilderness seemed impossibly distant. Here, civilization had already won. Angelo Bronte ruled much of the city's criminal underworld with sophistication rather than brute force. He welcomed Dutch and Arthur politely, recognizing that unnecessary conflict benefited neither side. After satisfying his own interests, Bronte eventually returned to Jack, unharmed, to his family. The reunion offered one of the few genuinely joyful moments the gang experienced after Blackwater. Jack's return reminded everyone they were still fighting to preserve a family. Yet Dutch interpreted the encounter with Bronte differently. Rather than appreciating the opportunity to leave Saint Denis behind, he became fascinated by the city's immense wealth. Banks held fortunes beyond anything the gang had previously imagined. Riverboats carried wealthy gamblers whose fortunes could change hands in a single evening. Industrialists, politicians, and businessmen seemed to possess more money than entire frontier towns. Dutch saw possibility. Arthur saw danger. Their perspectives had begun to diverge, though Arthur himself barely recognized it. The growing influence of Micah Bell only deepened the divide. More and more, Micah encouraged Dutch toward bold, violent solutions whenever uncertainty arose. Where Hosea advised patience, Micah praised decisive action. Where Arthur raised practical concerns, Micah dismissed them as weakness. Dutch listened more carefully than before, and Arthur noticed, but he did not yet understand its significance. But perhaps the first time in his life, he found himself quietly wondering whether Dutch had begun listening to different voices than the one that had guided the family through so many earlier years. The questions remained private. Arthur still carried out every responsibility asked of him, still protected those he loved, still believed the family could somehow survive. Yet beneath that loyalty, doubt had taken root. It remained small enough to ignore, for now. But like every seed planted in fertile ground, it would continue growing until it could no longer be overlooked. Saint Denis stood as a vision of the future. To many, it represented prosperity. To Dutch Vanderlyn, it represented nearly everything he despised. To him, Saint Denis was proof that civilization had ceased serving ordinary people. Wealth gathered behind marble facades, while laborers crowded filthy neighborhoods only streets away. Politicians, industrialists, and businessmen exercised authority with little regard for those beneath them. Here, power belonged not to courage or independence, but to money. Arthur understood Dutch's criticism, yet unlike his adopted father, he also saw the ordinary lives unfolding throughout the city. Dock workers earning honest wages, shopkeepers opening their doors each morning, families building futures that required neither revolvers nor robbery. For perhaps the first time, Arthur found himself wondering whether the life Dutch promised had ever truly been the only available path. Such thoughts remained private, however, as there was still work to do. Angelo Bronte, having returned Jack Marston safely to the gang, extended a cautious relationship with Dutch. The Italian crime lord understood the value of useful allies, though he trusted very few people completely. He offered information, opportunities, and introductions to influential figures within Saint Denis, while quietly assessing whether the Vanderlyn gang might prove more valuable as partners than enemies. Dutch eagerly accepted. Arthur remained suspicious. Bronte possessed refinement where Dutch possessed charisma. Both men could command a room with little more than their voices. Yet Arthur sensed Bronte viewed people as pieces upon a game board, valuable only so long as they served a purpose. In time, that suspicion proved justified. Bronte manipulated Dutch into attacking a city trolley station, suggesting it contained a fortune waiting to be seized. Instead, the robbery collapsed into chaos almost immediately. Police surrounded the gang before they could escape, forcing Arthur, Dutch, Linde, and the others into a desperate gunfight through the streets. Dutch suffered a severe blow to the head during the escape. Though he dismissed the injury afterward, Arthur noticed subtle changes. His temper grew shorter, his certainty more absolute. Rather than reflecting upon failures, Dutch blamed betrayal, bad luck, or insufficient loyalty from those around him. Whether the injury directly contributed to these changes remains uncertain. What is clear is that Arthur began recognizing a difference between the Dutch who had raised him and the man now leading the gang. Hosea recognized it as well. The older outlaw continued urging caution. He believed Bronte could no longer be trusted, and warned that every ambitious robbery drew greater attention from both the police and the Pinkertons. More importantly, Hosea questioned whether the gang truly needed another grand score after all. Perhaps, he suggested, they should simply disappear while they still could. Arthur found himself agreeing more often than before. Dutch did not. When Bronte's deception became undeniable, Dutch responded with calculated vengeance. Arthur accompanied him, along with John, to capture the crime lord. Bronte was taken from his own mansion under the cover of darkness and carried aboard a small boat into the swamps beyond the city. There, Dutch questioned him, but Bronte mocked him. The Italian laughed openly at Dutch's dream of escaping civilization, dismissing the gang as relics clinging to a world that no longer existed. Arthur watched the exchange in uneasy silence. He expected Dutch to simply shoot the man and be done with it. Instead, Dutch lost control. He seized Bronte and forced him beneath the water, holding him there long after resistance ceased. Even after death, Dutch's anger remained unsatisfied. He fed the body to the waiting alligators that inhabited the surrounding marsh. Arthur stood motionless. He had killed many men himself, but this felt different. There had been no urgency, no immediate threat, only rage. The moment lingered in Arthur's thoughts long afterward. It was not simply that Dutch had taken a life. Arthur had accepted violence as a part of outlaw existence long, long ago. Rather, it was the expression upon Dutch's face that troubled him most. He had seen satisfaction, not necessity. Despite growing unease, Dutch pressed forward with what he insisted would finally be the robbery that secured their future: the Saint Denis Bank. Hosea opposed the plan. Arthur questioned its timing. Even John expressed concern. Dutch dismissed them all. Once again, he promised that after this single score, they would vanish forever. The robbery began with remarkable precision. Hosea and Abigail created a diversion while Arthur, John, Dutch, Linne, Bill, Javier, and Micah entered the bank itself. For a brief moment, everything appeared to unfold exactly as planned. Then, the Pinkertons arrived. Agent Milton had anticipated the robbery. Whether through careful investigation or information supplied by unseen forces, the law surrounded the bank before the gang could escape. Outside, Hosea Matthews was captured. Arthur watched helplessly from a window as the old man stood beside Milton in the street below. Hosea did not plead. He did not panic. He remained calm. Then, Agent Milton shot him where he stood. The sound echoed across the city. For Arthur, it felt as though an entire chapter of his life ended in a single instant. Hosea had raised him, taught him, balanced Dutch whenever ambition threatened to outrun wisdom. And now, he lay dead in the streets, while the man Arthur had called father could only watch. Moments later, another loss followed. As the gang fought desperately through Saint Denis, young Linne Summers was struck by a rifle shot and killed almost instantly. Linne had possessed extraordinary promise. Intelligent, compassionate, and eager to learn, he represented a future that outlaw life rarely allowed. Arthur had come to care for him deeply, seeing echoes of his younger years in the thoughtful young man. His death carried the same cruel suddenness that had taken Sean. There would be no farewell, only another empty seat around the campfire. Surviving members fled toward the docks under relentless pursuit. Amid confusion and gunfire, they escaped aboard a ship leaving Saint Denis. Their destination scarcely mattered. Survival alone had become enough. And then nature intervened. A violent storm overtook the vessel, scattering its crew and passengers across the Caribbean island of Guarma. For Arthur, the island felt almost unreal. Dense tropical forests replaced temperate woodlands. Sugar plantations stretched beneath unfamiliar mountains, while local revolutionaries fought against Colonel Alberto Fusar, whose brutal regime maintained power through fear and military force. The Vanderlyn gang had escaped American law only to become entangled in another nation's conflict. Arthur adapted as he always had. He assisted local rebels, fought against Fusar's soldiers, and worked tirelessly beside his companions to secure passage home. Yet throughout these struggles, another change within Dutch became increasingly impossible to ignore. He grew more suspicious, more ruthless. Anyone who questioned him risked being treated as an obstacle rather than an ally. Arthur watched Dutch abandon an elderly woman after she had guided them through dangerous territory, killing her when he feared she might betray them. Once again, Arthur found himself unsettled, not because Dutch had acted decisively, but because he had acted so easily. When the surviving members finally returned to the United States, relief quickly gave way to new burdens. The gang had been scattered after Saint Denis, some arriving in Guarma and some scattered throughout the Midwest. Several members remained missing. Pinkerton pressure had only intensified. Perhaps most importantly, Arthur himself began noticing something he could no longer dismiss. It started as a cough. At first, it seemed little more than exhaustion brought on by weeks of hardship, poor food, and relentless travel. Arthur ignored it, as he ignored most discomfort. Throughout his life, he had endured broken bones, gunshot wounds, hunger, and exposure without complaint. This felt insignificant, at least until it no longer did. The coughing became more frequent, blood appeared. His strength was slowly diminishing. Still, Arthur continued placing the needs of others before his own, refusing to acknowledge what his body was trying to tell him. The gang eventually established another camp within the forest surrounding Beaver Hollow, though it scarcely resembled the family Arthur had once known. Laughter had grown rare. Conversations ended abruptly whenever Dutch approached. Micah spent more time whispering in Dutch's ear. John questioned decisions more openly. Charles, Sadie, and Arthur found themselves exchanging concerned glances rather than confident smiles. The family remained together. The trust did not. And then, one day in Saint Denis, Arthur collapsed. And as he awoke in the doctor's office, the doctor's diagnosis arrived to him without ceremony: tuberculosis. By 1899, there was no effective cure. Rest might slow its progress. Fresh air could ease suffering. But for someone living Arthur's life, constantly riding, fighting, and enduring hardship, the disease represented a death sentence. Arthur left the doctor's office into the busy streets of Saint Denis. The city bustled around him exactly as before. Street cars continued rolling. Merchants continued shouting. Children continued laughing. Nothing about the world had changed, only Arthur's place within it. For the first time since his childhood, he understood with certainty that his own life possessed an ending. Not one imagined in some distant future, one already rapidly approaching. This revelation altered something fundamental within him. Until then, Arthur had measured his worth through loyalty to the gang. Now another question began forming in his thoughts. If time was growing short, what kind of man had he truly become? Arthur Morgan had spent most of his life believing that loyalty could overcome almost anything. It had carried him through hunger, gunfights, bitter winters, and years spent fleeing the law. It had survived the death of friends, the collapse of carefully laid plans, and the gradual disappearance of the frontier itself. Loyalty had become the foundation upon which Arthur built his identity. Now, for the first time, loyalty itself demanded that he question the man to whom he had devoted his life. Tuberculosis transformed Arthur's view of the world in ways no gunfight ever had. Each morning reminded him that his strength was fading. Tasks that once seemed effortless now left him breathless. His persistent cough grew more severe. There were days when simply mounting his horse required determination. Arthur concealed his illness from much of the gang, not wishing to burden those already struggling beneath the weight of their own fears. Yet illness also stripped away distractions. Knowing his time was limited forced Arthur to examine the choices he had made and the life he had lived. He had spent years collecting debts for Leopold Strauss, intimidating desperate families who possessed little hope of repayment. This time, when sent to collect the debt that had fallen upon a deceased man's widow, rather than demanding payment, Arthur forgave the debt. It was a small act by any practical measure. To Arthur, it was the beginning of something much larger. One by one, he confronted the consequences of his past with a humility that had long remained buried beneath duty. He came to understand that many of the people he had once viewed as obstacles were simply trying to survive a challenging world, much as he himself had always done. His growing compassion stood in increasingly sharp contrast to Dutch's leadership. Rather than becoming more cautious after Saint Denis, Dutch grew ever more convinced that the answer lay in greater risks. Every setback strengthened his belief that someone within the gang lacked faith. Every disagreement appeared to him as betrayal rather than honest concern. Micah Bell encouraged these suspicions at every opportunity. Where Hosea had once challenged Dutch with patience and reason, Micah praised every impulsive decision. He assured Dutch that hesitation invited weakness, and that those questioning him lacked true loyalty. Without Hosea's calming influence, Dutch listened. Arthur watched this change with growing unease. One incident revealed how far Dutch had drifted from the man Arthur once admired. The gang had become involved in the struggles of the Wapiti people, whose reservation lay under increasing pressure from the United States Army and industrial interests seeking access to valuable oil deposits. Colonel Henry Favors, commanding nearby forces, exploited every opportunity to provoke conflict, while the ambitious government agent Leviticus Cornwall continued pursuing wealth wherever it could be found. Among the Wapiti, Arthur came to know Rains Fall, the tribe's thoughtful and deeply respected chief. Rains Fall possessed none of Dutch's theatrical charisma. He spoke quietly, patiently. His authority came not from commanding others, but from understanding them. Throughout their conversations, Arthur encountered a man whose wisdom resembled Hosea's far more than Dutch's. Rains Fall sought peace wherever possible, believing violence would only accelerate the destruction of his people. His son, Eagle Flies, believed otherwise. Young, proud, and desperate to defend his homeland, Eagle Flies viewed armed resistance as the only honorable response to injustice. Dutch quickly recognized the younger man's anger as something he could exploit. He encouraged confrontation, promised support, spoke once again of fighting tyranny and defending freedom. Arthur understood what was happening almost immediately. Dutch no longer sought to survive. He sought conflict itself. The Wapiti became another means of distracting the army and Pinkertons from the gang's own movements. Arthur tried repeatedly to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. He aided Rains Fall whenever possible, covering sacred artifacts and helping the chief search for peaceful alternatives. These quiet journeys through the mountains offered Arthur rare moments of reflection. Rains Fall never judged him for his past. Instead, he spoke gently about the burden of regret. He reminded Arthur that a man's final actions often carried greater weight than those that came before. Those conversations lingered with Arthur. For perhaps the first time, someone had offered him the possibility that redemption did not belong solely to saints or innocent people. It might also belong to men who recognized their failures before the end. Meanwhile, Dutch's decisions became difficult to defend. Leviticus Cornwall eventually confronted Dutch face to face, hoping wealth and reason might finally persuade the outlaw to surrender. Instead, Dutch shot him without warning. The killing accomplished almost nothing. Cornwall's immense business empire continued without him, while his death only intensified the government's determination to destroy the Vanderlyn gang completely. Arthur could no longer convince himself that Dutch acted according to any larger plan. He was reacting, lashing out, searching desperately for victories that never seemed to arrive. Then came the incident that shattered whatever confidence Arthur still possessed. During an attempted raid on an army payroll, John Marston was captured. Arthur naturally assumed the gang would organize a rescue. But Dutch hesitated. He questioned whether saving John remained worth the risk. Arthur could hardly believe what he was hearing. John had grown up beside him. He had bled for the gang. risked his life countless times, and now Dutch spoke of abandoning him as though he were simply another disposable member. And so Arthur rescued John himself. And while the mission succeeded, the consequences extended far beyond John's freedom. For the first time, Arthur openly had defied Dutch, not through anger, but through conscience. John, weakened by imprisonment, noticed the change as well. The two men had often argued throughout their lives, yet those old rivalries now seemed insignificant. Arthur found himself encouraging John to think not about the gang, but about Abigail and Jack. They deserved something better, something beyond endless flight. Arthur quietly urged John to leave while he still could. It was advice Arthur wished someone had given to him decades earlier. Back at Beaver Hollow, suspicion poisoned nearly every conversation. Micah insisted there was a traitor among them, and Dutch agreed. Arthur recognized the bitter irony. The gang had once survived because its members trusted one another completely. Now fear accomplished what Pinkertons and rival outlaws never had. It divided the family from within. Arthur's own health continued deteriorating rapidly. His coughing fits grew violent. His face became thinner, his movements slower. Yet despite his physical decline, he displayed a clarity of purpose unseen at any earlier point in his life. He no longer sought wealth or dreamed of Tahiti. His only concern was ensuring that those who still possessed a future might live to reach it. This resolve was strengthened by one final conversation. Depending upon the choices Arthur had made throughout his life, he found either Sister Calderon waiting at the Saint Denis railway station or Reverend Orville Swanson before his departure. Both conversations arrived at precisely the moment Arthur needed them. To Sister Calderon, Arthur confessed fears he had hidden from nearly everyone. "I'm afraid." They were among the simplest words he had ever spoken, also among the most honest. The sister did not dismiss his fear. She reminded him that despite everything he had done, he still possessed the ability to choose kindness over cruelty, compassion over bitterness. A person's worth, she suggested, could not be measured solely by the mistakes already behind them. If Reverend Swanson met Arthur instead, he offered similar comfort from the perspective of a man who had himself struggled with weakness and redemption. In either case, Arthur departed changed. Not because someone had promised forgiveness, but because someone believed he remained capable of earning it. The final collapse came swiftly. Agent Milton eventually revealed the truth Arthur had long feared. Micah Bell had been cooperating with the Pinkertons. Many of the authorities' uncanny successes suddenly became understandable. Arthur confronted Dutch immediately. He expected outrage. Instead, Dutch hesitated. The hesitation wounded Arthur more deeply than any accusation. After everything they had shared, after decades spent risking his life, Dutch no longer knew whom to believe. That uncertainty told Arthur everything. The father who had once rescued an orphan from the wilderness was gone. In his place stood a man consumed by pride, suspicion, and dreams that had long since become impossible. The Vanderlinde gang, once held together by trust, finally fractured beyond repair. Friends chose sides. Weapons were drawn. Voices that had laughed together around campfires now shouted accusations beneath the dark trees of Beaver Hollow. The family Arthur had spent his entire life protecting no longer existed. Only scattered fragments remained. And Arthur Morgan, with what little strength illness had left him, resolved to spend the remainder of his life saving the people who could still be saved. The final hours of Arthur Morgan's life unfolded beneath a sky that seemed indifferent to the struggles of men. The Vanderlyn gang had ceased to exist as a family. Beaver Hollow echoed with raised voices and accusations. Men and women who had shared meals around the same campfire for years now regarded one another with suspicion, unsure who still deserved their trust. The ideals that had once united them had slowly eroded beneath fear, pride, and betrayal, until almost nothing remained. Arthur had accepted that the gang could not be saved, only its people. Knowing his own life was drawing to a close, he devoted every remaining ounce of strength to ensuring that John Marston, Abigail Roberts, and young Jack escaped the fate awaiting everyone who continued following Dutch. For years, Arthur had judged John harshly. He had criticized his tendency to disappear when responsibility became difficult. He questioned John's commitment to Abigail and often doubted whether he appreciated the family he had been given. Yet illness and reflection had changed Arthur's perspective. John still possessed something Arthur had lost many years earlier, a future. If anyone deserved the chance to leave the outlaw life behind, it was the young family Arthur had watched grow from childhood. Arthur urged John repeatedly to stop thinking like an outlaw. He spoke not about one last score or one final robbery, but about a home, about Abigail, about Jack. For perhaps the first time in either man's life, Arthur spoke less as Dutch's loyal lieutenant and more as an older brother. John listened. The escape itself unfolded amid confusion and violence. Pinkerton agents descended upon Beaver Hollow, while the fractured remnants of the gang scattered into the surrounding wilderness. Gunfire echoed through the caves as men who had once fought shoulder to shoulder now fled in every direction. Arthur found John during the chaos. Despite his worsening illness, he helped force a path through the attackers, placing John's survival above his own. Together, they fought toward the mountains, carving out precious moments that allowed John to reunite with Abigail and continue his escape. Arthur could have ridden with him. Instead, he turned back. Micah Bell remained. Dutch remained. There were still truths that needed confronting. Arthur pursued Micah into the high country. His body weakened, but his resolve stronger than it had ever been. The climb itself became a battle against failing lungs. Every steep incline left him gasping for breath. Every violent cough reminded him that time was slipping away. And yet he continued, not for revenge alone, but for truth. Micah greeted Arthur with the confidence of a man who believed victory was already assured. There was little point in hiding his treachery any longer. The gang had already collapsed. The Pinkertons had already won. Arthur accused him openly of betraying the family. Micah answered with mockery. The confrontation that followed was the representation of the final struggle between two competing visions of what the Vanderlyn gang had become. Arthur had spent his life believing loyalty existed to protect people. Micah believed loyalty existed only so long as it served personal advantage. Arthur fought despite exhaustion. His strength no longer matched the formidable outlaw he had once been, but determination carried him farther than his failing body should have allowed. Years of experience, instinct, and stubborn resolve kept him standing long after illness insisted that he should fall. And then Dutch arrived. For one brief moment, Arthur still hoped. After everything they had shared, after decades spent riding together across the American frontier, Arthur believed Dutch would finally see the truth standing before him. He begged him to look, to recognize what Micah had done, to remember who Arthur had always been to him. Dutch said very little. Perhaps there were no words left capable of repairing what had already been broken. He looked from Arthur to Micah and back again. The silence carried greater weight than any accusation. Arthur finally understood that the father he loved no longer existed. Not because Dutch had died, but because pride had gradually consumed the qualities that had once made him worthy of such devotion. There would be no reconciliation, only acceptance. Depending again upon the choices Arthur made throughout his life, the final moments unfolded differently in detail, yet they carried the same essential truth. If Arthur had lived honorably, he remained upon the mountainside as dawn slowly broke across the eastern horizon. Too weak to continue fighting, he watched the first light spread across forests and distant valleys, while his breathing grew steadily quieter and slower. The rising sun greeted him at the end. It was a peaceful conclusion, granted not because Arthur had lived a perfect life, but because he had spent his final days choosing compassion over bitterness, sacrifice over self-preservation. If Arthur had embraced a darker path throughout his life, Micah instead became the instrument of his death during their final struggle. Even then, however, Arthur's greatest victory remained unchanged. John escaped, and that was enough. Arthur Morgan died in 1899. He was only 36 years old. No monument marked the passing of the man who had once been among the most capable outlaws in the American West. No newspapers devoted little attention to his death. Governments celebrated the gradual destruction of another notorious gang. The expanding nation simply continued moving forward, scarcely noticing that one of the last great figures of the frontier had quietly disappeared. Yet history often remembers influence more faithfully than fame. Arthur's legacy endured through those who survived him. John Marston carried Arthur's final words to him for the rest of his life. Instead of chasing impossible dreams, John built a small ranch at Beecher's Hope alongside Abigail and Jack. The life proved difficult, filled with hard labor and constant uncertainty, but it represented something Arthur had come to value above all else: an honest chance. John repeatedly struggled to escape his past. Circumstances, many beyond his control, continued drawing him back toward violence. Yet every time he faced those crossroads, Arthur's example lingered in memory. Keep your family safe. Choose them, and leave this life behind.